The 16th winter in the same dress, a Lakota chief brought her cloth dyed like the sky. The bolt of cloth was heavier than I expected. That is where I begin, because that is where everything begins for me, not the woman, not the long road back to her, not even the war that put the road between us. The weight of that cloth in my arms. Blue-dyed cotton, woven tight, still smelling of the trader's wagon, of pine pitch and iron wheel grease, and something sweet underneath that I could not name. I had carried it tied to my horse for 11 days. I had crossed the Powder River when it was running cold with snowmelt, and the current pushed at my knees, and the cloth stayed dry because I held it above my head like a man carrying a child across the water. 11 days on the trail. One bolt of cloth. My name is Charging Hawk. I have been chief of my band since I was 32 years old, and I am not a man who explains himself. I say this not to brag. Bragging is something young men do when they are not yet sure of what they are. I say it because what I did for Margaret Holt does not fit easily into words, and the easiest lie I could tell you is that I did it out of goodness. I did not do it out of goodness. I did it because I had looked at her across a fire one November night, and seen what 16 winters of want does to a woman who is too proud to say she is tired, and something in me that has no name and that I did not invite decided it was going to be answered. I will tell you the whole of it, all the way back to the beginning. Then you will understand why the cloth mattered. She came to this country in the year I turned 40. I know this because that was the year my wife sunk a waist good dog. We called her that as a child and it stuck, which she always pretended to hate. That was the year Sunk a Waist died of a sickness that started in her chest and didn't stop. We buried her in October, on a hill above the creek where she used to take the children in summer, and I stood at that grave a long time after everyone else had gone down. The wind was from the north. It had already gotten its teeth back after the warm weeks, and it bit through my shirt and I let it. I needed something to bite me, something real. The grief was too big to hold inside a body, and I needed the wind to come at me from outside so I could press against it. That winter was the first winter I was chief alone. I don't mean my band wasn't there. I mean I came back to the camp at night and there was no one in my lodge who knew the sound I made when I was worried, the way I got quiet in a particular way that was different from my ordinary quiet. Sunk a Waist knew that. She would put her hand on my arm without a word when she heard it, and that was all I needed. After she was gone, the quiet in my lodge was just quiet. Margaret Holt came that same year in the fall, before the ground froze. She came with her husband, a man named Luther, and 2 boys, the older one maybe 12, the younger one 8 or 9 with a broken front tooth that made him whistle when he talked. They were part of a larger group of settlers moving through our territory. Most of them kept moving. Luther Holt stopped. He had looked at a particular piece of ground near the fork of 2 creeks and decided it was his. I saw her for the first time at a distance, maybe 200 yards. She was unloading a wagon. What I noticed, I don't know why I noticed this instead of something else, was that she worked without stopping to look around. Most settlers, when they come into new country, look around all the time. They are watching for us. She wasn't watching for anything. She was just working, carrying bundles from the wagon to the ground, her back straight, moving in the efficient way of a woman who has learned not to waste motion, because there is always more to do than hours. I did not speak to her that fall. I spoke to Luther. He came to our camp after 3 days on his land, which is the right thing to do, and I will give him credit for that. He was a big man, red in the face from cold or sun or maybe just his nature, and he was not afraid of me, which I respected, and he was not foolish either, which I also respected. We talked through a man named Breeds 2 Horses who knew enough English to get the meaning across, and we came to an understanding. He would stay on his land. He would not push into our hunting grounds, past the eastern ridge. If he had problems, he would come to me before doing anything that couldn't be undone. I would leave him in peace and his cattle in peace, and if any young men of mine troubled him, he should come to me and I would handle it. It was a fair arrangement, and both of us knew it could break on either side. That is how all arrangements are. You make them honestly and then you watch. The first winter I watched from a distance. His cattle were thin in the spring, which told me the hay he'd put up had run short, or maybe the winter took more of it than he'd planned. But they made it, most of them, and by April he had put his boys to work on a second structure beside the main cabin, a proper shelter for the animals, which told me he was learning. I did not go to his land that year, not once. The second winter, one of my young men, a fool named Iron in the road who is dead now from his own recklessness, so I will not say too much against him. He took 2 of Luther Holt's steers. I found out in 3 days. I made him take back the steers and the hide of one he'd already slaughtered and 2 horses besides, which was more than fair payment and was meant to be, because overpaying in a situation like that closes the door before trouble can walk through it. I rode to Luther Holt's land myself to make the exchange. That was the first time I was close enough to see her face. She was standing in the doorway of the cabin when I came up with the horses and the 2 live steers on a lead. Luther met me in the yard. We did the exchange. I could feel her watching from the doorway the whole time, and once, when I glanced over, she didn't look away. Most white women look away fast when an Indian looks at them directly. She didn't. She just looked at me with dark eyes that were taking things in, assessing, the way a person looks when they are trying to decide something. I didn't know what she was deciding. Breed's 2 horses said to Luther with my words, "This is honest payment and more. Keep your man in line and I will keep mine." Luther nodded and said he understood. Then I turned my horse and rode out of the yard, and I did not look back at the doorway. But I thought about those eyes for longer than I should have. The thing I need to tell you about is the 3rd year. The 3rd year, Luther Holt got sick. I heard about it through a mixed-blood man who traded between our camps and the settler communities, a man named Pettibone who knew everything because he was useful to everyone and so everyone talked in front of him. Luther had some trouble with his lungs. He was down through December and January, could barely stand. And Margaret Holt ran that ranch alone with 2 boys, the older one 13 now, the younger one 10, both working like grown men because they had to. I thought about that. I didn't do anything about it. It wasn't my place yet. Luther Holt was still living. He recovered enough by February to be on his feet, and I heard he was better by March, and that spring he was out working again. So I let it go. It wasn't my situation to enter. But I had noticed. And once I notice something, I don't unnotice it. The 4th year I went to their land twice on my own, not because there was trouble but because I wanted to look at the operation, see how they were doing, get a clear picture. Both times I spoke with Luther, and both times he was decent and straight with me and asked good questions about the spring hunt and the condition of the elk herds and how the passes were holding. He was building something. The ranch was getting better, more cattle. A 3rd structure now that looked like it would hold grain, the boys big enough to pull real weight. Margaret Holt was there both times, and she said very little. The second time, she brought out a tin cup of coffee and gave it to me without saying anything, and that was more than most women in this country would have done. And I drank it because refusing a small thing is a way of making it larger than it needs to be. She was not a beautiful woman in the way some women are beautiful, the way it hits you first. She was something slower than that, something you kept seeing more of. Her face was thin from hard work and sun, and her hair was the color of old wheat straw going a little gray at the temples, and she had a way of moving that was careful and exact, nothing wasted, nothing flourished. The kind of woman who, if she touched something, meant to touch it. I rode home both times and I told myself, I was just watching the situation. Being a responsible neighbor, keeping track. I did not think about Sunka waste. Not directly. But she was there somewhere in the back of it, the way things that are true are always there in the back even when you're not facing them. Luther Holt died in the 7th year. It was his heart. He went quickly, which is the right way to go if you have to go, though I doubt he thought so when the moment came. The two boys were 16 and 14 by then, big enough to work but not yet men, and Margaret Holt was left with a ranch and two sons and a winter coming in fast. I heard about it from Pettibone within a week. I sat with that information for 2 days. Then I did something that I did not ask my counsel about because I knew what they would say, and I did not want to hear it. I rode to her land. She was out in the yard when I came. The older boy, his name was Caleb, was splitting wood nearby, and he straightened up when he saw me and put the axe handle in both hands, not raising it, just holding it, which was the right instinct, and I did not hold it against him. I stopped my horse in the yard and looked at Margaret Holt, and I said, through signs and the few English words I had then, that I was sorry about her husband, that he had been a man I respected. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, in a voice that was steady as a post driven deep, "Thank you for that." I asked her through signs whether she needed anything. She said she did not. I believed that she believed it. I rode home. She did not fall apart. I want to say this clearly because some people hearing this story will expect a woman left alone to fall apart, and Margaret Holt did not do that. She ran the ranch. She ran it hard. She had two sons who were becoming men, and she worked beside them every day, and by spring she had expanded the herd by 4 animals from good trades, and the cattle came through the winter better than they had under Luther, which told me she had her own competence that had been there all along, maybe unused. I went to her land 3 times that first year she was a widow, once in winter to check conditions and bring a side of venison, which she accepted without a fuss. No performance about accepting charity, just a nod and a word of thanks, and the venison went inside. Once in spring to see about a fence line that had drifted in the wrong direction, not toward my land, but toward a neighbor of hers who might have caused trouble, and I straightened that out before it started. Once in fall to talk about the elk coming through that season, where they were running, which mattered to her because the elk could move through a fence and take it down with them. Each time we talked a little more than the time before. Her English was clear and direct, no softness in it but no meanness either. She asked about things that mattered, the weather patterns I'd been watching, the condition of the passes, what I knew about a dry spell coming and how long it might run. She wasn't making conversation. She was gathering information. That is the kind of mind I have always respected most. The kind that is always working even when the mouth is quiet. Her younger boy, whose name was Thomas and who still whistled through that broken tooth now that he was older, started following me around when I came to the property, not in a bothersome way, in the way of a boy who wants to see what a man does and how he does it. I let him. I showed him how to read a cut bank for water, how to look at the graze pattern of cattle and know what the grass was telling you. He learned fast, that boy. He had his mother's kind of mind. Caleb was different. Caleb was watchful and proud and a little suspicious of me the whole first year, which was right, which was protective, and I respected it. He had become the man of the house in his thinking, and he was not wrong to feel that way. I did not push against it. You don't push against the right instinct in a young man. You wait and let time do the work. The years stacked up. I will not tell you each one the same way because they were not the same. They had different weather, different trouble, different small moments that I did not know I was storing until much later when I found them still there, complete and clear, in the part of my memory where the things that matter live. Year 9, a hard freeze in April took half her calves. I brought 3 young cattle from my own herd. She told me she would pay me back when she could. I told her not to rush. She paid me back in 2 years, horses, not cattle, which were worth more, which was her way of saying that she understood the value of what had passed between us. Year 10. One of my young men was in a dispute with a white family 3 miles south of her, a family named Greer who were bad actors, and the thing was moving towards something it couldn't come back from. Margaret Holt rode to the Greer place herself. I heard about this afterward, not from her. She told them that if they had a problem with my people they could bring it to her first, that she had a working arrangement with my band, and she would not have it disturbed by men who didn't understand the country. I don't know exactly what she said, but the Greers backed down and the thing died there. She never mentioned it to me. Not once. Year 11. Her older boy Caleb got married, a girl from a settlement 60 miles east, and he started building on a piece of ground of his own about 12 miles from his mother's land. He came to me before he went. He stood in my camp and said that he wanted my blessing on the piece he'd chosen, that he knew it bordered some country I moved through in summer, and he wanted to know if there would be trouble. I looked at him. He was 23, big like his father had been, that same red in the face but his mother's eyes. I told him there would not be trouble. He put out his hand and I shook it. Then he said, "You've looked out for my mother a long time. I'm grateful." He said it straight, no embarrassment in it, the way a man says what is true. I went home from that conversation, and I sat by my fire for a long time. Year 12 was a drought year. I have seen droughts in this country. Every man who has lived long enough in open country has seen years when the sky goes white and stays white, and the grass goes to nothing, and the creeks pull back to their bones. Year 12 was that kind. The worst since I was a young man. By July, the creek at the fork of her land had dropped to a string of pools, and the grass was burned down to nubs, and her cattle were getting thin. I moved my band east that summer to better water. Before I went, I made arrangements. I told 2 of my men, Tall Willow, and a man we called Ceasefar, who had good judgment and no interest in proving himself. I told them to check on Margaret Holt's ranch every 10 days through the summer. Not to do work for her unless she asked, just to look and report to me. Tall Willow came back in August with the report. She was struggling. The cattle were thin, the creek was low, and she had one of her horses down with some kind of sickness. Thomas, her younger boy, who was 19 now, was working 20-hour days, and it still wasn't enough. They were going to lose cattle, maybe many of them. I rode back myself. I came to her land on a day so hot the air had no color in it. The ground was cracked and the creek was almost dry, and the remaining pools had a skin on them that wasn't right. She was in the yard when I came up, her hat down and her sleeves rolled and her face dark from sun, and she looked at me without surprise, as if she had half expected me, which maybe she had. I told her I had better English by then, enough to say most things without too many signs. I told her I had come to help move the cattle. She said, "To where?" I said, "West, past the second ridge. There's water there and the grass is better." She said, "That's your summer range." I said, "It has been a bad year. There is enough for both." She looked at me the way she sometimes looked at me, taking things in, deciding. She said, "I won't be in your debt past what I can pay." I said, "This is neighboring, not debt." She held my eyes for a count of maybe 5. Then she turned and called Thomas out of the barn and said, "We're moving the cattle." It took us 3 days. Tall Willow came back and helped. Thomas worked hard beside us and did not need to be told things twice. We moved what was left of her herd to the West Range, and they had good water and good grass, and by the time I checked in September, they had put weight back on, and she was going to come out of the drought year with losses, but not ruin. On the last day of the cattle move, when we were riding back to her property in the early evening, the light going orange and the heat finally coming out of the air, she rode beside me and she said, without turning her head, "I don't know how to square this, charging hawk." I said, "You don't need to." She said, "That's not how I was raised." I said, "Then be raised different." She was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was too dry to be sure. Year 13. Thomas married a Lakota woman. Her name was Walks Far, a relation of my wife's people, a serious girl with a good character, and she and Thomas had been finding their way toward each other for 2 years before he finally said anything. I might have had a hand in how easy that was. I might have made certain things clear to Walks Far's family without Thomas knowing. I am not going to pretend otherwise. When Thomas told his mother, Margaret Holt sat very still for a moment. Thomas said she was quiet for so long he thought she was going to say something hard. Then she said, "Is she good to you?" He said yes. She said, "Then bring her to dinner." That was it. That was Margaret Holt. Year 14 was a year of trouble with other bands. Nothing that touched her ranch directly. But there was raiding happening to the south, and 2 settler families in that direction lost cattle, and one of them lost a barn. I sent word to Margaret Holt through Thomas that she should pull any cattle off her south pasture for 2 months and keep her horses close. She did it that same day. She asked no questions. I said a thing and she acted on it, and that is a rare and particular kind of trust. Year 15. Caleb came back from his own land for a week to help his mother with a roof that had gone bad. He and Thomas and I put 4 days into it. When it was done, Caleb looked at it from the yard and said it was better than new. He wasn't wrong. Afterward, in the evening, we sat out front and Caleb told his mother that he wanted her to come live near him, that she didn't need to run this ranch alone anymore, that she'd done it long enough. She said she would think about it. She looked at me when she said it, just briefly, and then looked back at her son. I said nothing. I drove home that night thinking about the word alone. She had not lived alone. Not really. Not for 8 years. But she lived in her house alone, and that is a different thing, and both of us knew it and neither of us had said so. Which brings me to the 16th winter. October and cold early. I was in my camp sorting out the fall arrangements, the placement of the winter camp, the distribution of what we had put up. My daughter, Sunka Waste's daughter, who is called Morning Keeps, came to me and asked me something. She was married herself by then, with 2 small children, and she had her mother's way of asking things that weren't questions. She said, "You rode to the Holt woman's ranch again last week." I said I did. She said, "And the week before?" I said nothing. She said, "Father, I'm not my mother, but I am her daughter, so I will ask you what she would ask you. What are you waiting for?" I looked at her for a long time. She had Sunka Waste's eyes. I said, "I am not waiting for anything." She said, "You've been going to that ranch for 9 years. You've moved her cattle, fixed her fences, sent men to watch over her, brought her venison, got her boy a good wife from our people. What does that look like to you?" I said, "It looks like neighboring." She looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when I said something that I knew was not quite the truth. She said, "Buy her something, Father. Something she needs. Something a man brings to a woman he intends to stand beside." I said, "I am already beside her." She said she doesn't know that. I sat with that for 3 days, then I got on my horse. I rode to the trading post at Broken Bow, which is 40 miles, and it took me 2 days because I stopped to hunt in order not to arrive empty. I found a bolt of cloth in that post, blue cotton, dyed proper, the color of sky in October when it goes deep. I had seen Margaret Holt in the same dress for years, the same brown wool dress, decent still but thin at the elbows, patched twice at the hem, and another dress that was worse. I had noticed this the way I notice everything I do not plan to notice. I had not done anything about it because there had always been something more pressing to address first. The cattle, the roof, the trouble to the south, her son's marriage, the drought. But my daughter was right. I bought the cloth and a paper of pins and a spool of thread, and I had the trader wrap it in oilcloth against the weather, and I tied it to my horse and I rode. 11 days, the Powder River crossing, the cloth above my head in both arms. I came to her land on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because Thomas was there with Walks Far, and they came on Tuesdays sometimes to help with things, and Walks Far was in the garden pulling the last of the root vegetables before the hard freeze. Margaret Holt was at the fence line on the east side, pulling a strand of wire that had come loose from its staple. She had gloves on and a coat that had been her husband's, too big for her, the sleeves rolled back. She looked up when she heard my horse. I got down, I untied the package from my saddle, I carried it to her. She pulled her gloves off and took the oilcloth parcel and stood there a moment looking at it, then looked at me, then back at the parcel. She undid the oilcloth tie and pulled it back. Blue cloth, the color of October sky. She stood very still. Her face did not change exactly, but something behind it changed, the way light changes in a room when a door opens somewhere else in the house. She said, "Charging Hawk." I said, "You've been wearing that brown dress since the year your husband died." She said, "It's still good." I said, "I know it is. This isn't about the dress." She looked up at me then all the way. Dark eyes, same as the first time. She wasn't deciding anything anymore. She had already decided. I could see that. She had decided some time ago, and she had been waiting to see if I would get around to it. She said, "What is it about?" I said, "It's about the kind of man I am, and whether you'd like to have that man beside you for the winters that are left." She looked at me a long time. Wind came across the yard and moved the grass at the fence line, and that was the only sound. Then she said, "I would like that." Just that, plain, no performance. The way she said everything. She held the cloth in her arms, both arms around it, not like a woman holding a gift, more like a woman holding something she had been waiting for without quite admitting it. She looked at the blue of it and then at me, and the corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Something older than a smile. I put my hand on the back of her head then, gentle, the way you put your hand on something you are not going to lose. Her hair was cold from the wind, and I could feel it under my palm, and she leaned into it, just slightly, just the way a tired person leans when something solid is finally there. Thomas had come out of nowhere at some point and was standing by the corner of the barn pretending not to see us, which was good of him. We were married that November, before the deep cold. I will not describe the ceremony because it was ours and not yours. What I will tell you is that my daughter Morning Keeps wept from the beginning of it to the end, and then said she had not been weeping at all, which was her mother's stubbornness living on in her. I did not move into her cabin. She did not move into my camp. We made a third arrangement, a winter place between our two worlds, on the land near the creek where it ran cleaner, and we built it together over 6 days with help from Thomas and walks far and 2 of my men and Caleb, who rode in from his place with his wife and worked for 4 days without being asked. His wife was a good woman too. She and Margaret did not talk much, but they worked in a way that told you they understood each other. The cabin was not large. It had 1 room with a good fireplace and 2 windows that faced east because Margaret said she had spent too many mornings in a dark house, and she was done with that. The floor was tight wood. The roof was better than any roof I had made before because Caleb had shown me something about the way to seat the ridge beam that I had not known. The first night in that cabin, the fire was going and the cold was outside where cold belongs, and Margaret was sitting on the bench by the table with blue cloth in her lap. She hadn't made it into anything yet. She was just sitting with it, and I was looking at her from across the room. She said without looking up, "What are you looking at?" I said, "You." She said, "There are duller things to look at." I said, "I know. I've been looking at them for 16 winters." She did look up then. I have been thinking since that night about what I would say if someone asked me what those 16 years were, what they added up to, what I was doing all that time before I got on my horse with a bolt of cloth. And the answer is that I was being what I am. A chief takes care of his people. That is not a title, it is a practice, and the practice is constant, and it is not about credit, and it does not stop when you are tired. You see what needs doing and you do it, and you do not make a speech about it. You are the rock that the water goes around. You are the thing that holds when other things are moving. That is what I have always been. What I did not know, for a long time, was that Margaret Holt had been watching me be exactly that. She told me, one evening that first winter, what she had thought on the day I brought back the steers that my young man had stolen, the second year, when she stood in the doorway and watched me in the yard. She said she had thought, "That is a man who keeps order, not who imposes it, who keeps it." She said she had thought, "A man who corrects his own people before they can be corrected by someone else understands something that most men never get around to understanding." She said she had watched me for 9 more years after that, thinking the same thing, in different forms. The cattle moved in the drought, the word sent about the southern trouble, the sun guided toward a good marriage, the roof. She said, "I knew it before I knew what to do with it." I said, "And now you know what to do with it." She said, "Now I'm 61 years old, and I know what to do with it." I said, "Better than not knowing." She said, "Considerably." She made the blue cloth into 2 things. A dress for herself and a shirt for me, the same cloth, same blue, sky-colored. She wore hers for the first time in January, and I wore mine, and Thomas, when he came that Tuesday, looked at us standing in the yard and then looked away quickly in the way young people do when they see their parents in something that moves them, and they don't know what to do with it. I wore that shirt until it was thin at the collar and the cuffs. Then I kept it folded in a cedar box. The dress she wore until she wore it out. When she wore it out, she made a quilt from the pieces. When the quilt wore thin, she kept it folded too. We were like that, both of us. We kept the things that mattered in places where they would hold. I am an old man now. My camp is smaller than it was, and the world has changed around us in ways I will not speak of tonight, because tonight I am telling you about 16 winters and a bolt of cloth, and a woman standing in a yard with the cold coming in off the prairie and something in her face that told me I had found the thing I had been building toward without quite knowing I was building. She is here. She is sleeping in the room behind me right now. I can hear her breathing from where I sit, which is near the window that faces east, the window she put there so she would never wake up in the dark again. I am not a man who expected a second good woman in his life. I thought that was done for me when Sunka waste went into the ground. A man like me does not complain about that. You take what was given and you are grateful and you keep going. That is what I had decided. But my daughter was right. I had been going to that ranch for 9 years. I had been bringing venison and moving cattle and fixing fence and sending men to watch and buying cloth at the trading post 40 miles away and carrying it across a cold river with my arms above my head. "What does that look like?" she asked me. It looks like a man who found, in his own quiet way, without knowing it was happening, that there was one more thing he was built for, one more person to stand beside, one more window to face east for, because the light there in the mornings is the same light it has always been, and there is a woman beside him who sees it and says nothing, because there is nothing to say, because the light is simply good and so is she, and so, for all my years, am I. The bolt of cloth was heavier than I expected. I'm glad I carried it.